The line becomes a river, page 44, bottom text. Agents found Martin de la Vega and his 3 companions on the bombing range more than 50 miles north of the border. The 4 men had been in the desert for 6 days and had wandered in the July heat for over 48 hours without food or water. By the time of rescue, one of the men had already met his death. Of the survivors, one was quickly treated and discharged from the hospital, while the other remained in intensive care, recently woken up from a coma, unable to remember his own name. When I arrived to the hospital asking for the 3rd survivor, nurses explained he was recovering from kidney failure, and guided me to his bedroom, where he laid hidden in a dark stone in white sheets. Excuse me. I had been charged with watching over De La Vega until his condition was stable, at which I would transport him to the station to be processed for deportation. I settled into the chair next to him, and after several minutes of silence I asked him to tell me about himself. He answered timidly, as if unsure what to say or even how to speak. He apologized for his Spanish, explaining he only knew what they had taught him in school. He came from the jungles of Guero, he told me. In his village they spoke Mixtec and farmed the green earth. He was a father of 7 children, he said 5 girls and 2 boys. His eldest daughter lived in California. He had crossed the border with plans to go there, to live with her and find work. We spent the following hours watching telenovelas, and occasionally he would turn to ask me about the women in America, wondering if they were like the ones on TV. He began to tell me about his youngest daughter, still in Mexico. She had just turned 18, he said. You could marry her. Later that afternoon, De La Vega was cleared for release. The nurses brought in his belongings, a pair of blue jeans and sneakers with holes worn through the soles. I asked what happened to his shirt. I don't know, he answered. I looked at the nurse. She shrugged, telling me he came in this way. We've got no clothes here, she added, only hospital gowns. As we exited through the hospital lobby, I watched the way eyes fell across his shirtless body. I imagined him alone and half naked in the days to come as he was ferried through the alien territory, booked and transferred between government processing centers, and finally fused to the border to re-enter his country. In the parking lot, I placed him in the passenger seat of my patrol vehicle and popped the trunk. At the back of the cruiser, I unbuckled my gun belt, unbuttoned my uniform shirt, and removed my white V-neck. I reassembled my uniform and returned to the passenger door to offer him my undershirt. Before leaving town, I asked him if he was hungry. You should eat something now, I told him. At the station, there's only juice and crackers. I asked what he's hungry for. What do Americans eat? He asked. I laughed. Here we mostly eat Mexican food. He looked at me unbelievingly. But we also eat hamburgers, I said. We pulled into a McDonald's, and at the drive-thru window, De La Vega turned to me. He told me he didn't have any money. Yo te invito, I said. As we drove south along the open highway, I turned into a Mexican radio station, and we listened to the sounds of norteño as he ate his meal. After finishing, he sat silently next to me, watching the passing desert. Then, as if whispering to me or to someone else, he began to speak of the rain in Guero, of the wet and green jungle, and I wondered if he could ever have been made to imagine a place like this, a place where one of his companions would meet his death and another would be made to forget his own name, a landscape where the earth seized with volcanic heat. As I cut for sight along the border road, I watched a Sereno coach-whipped snake try to find its way into Mexico through the pedestrian fence. The animal slithered along the length of the mesh, looking for a way south, hitting its head against the rusted metal again and again until I finally guided it over to the wide opening of a wash grate. After the snake made its way across the adjacent road, I stood for a while looking through the small mesh, staring at the undulating tracks left in the desert. A woman stood on the south side of the pedestrian fence, flagging me down as I passed her on the border road. I stopped my vehicle and went over to her. With a panic in her voice, she asked me if I knew about her son. He had crossed days ago, she said, or maybe it was a week ago. She wasn't sure. She hadn't heard anything from him. No one had. And she didn't know if he had been caught or was lost somewhere in the desert, or if he was even still alive. Estamos despertados, she told me, her voice quivering, with one hand clawing at her chest and the other trembling against the fence. I don't remember what I told her, if I took down the man's name, or if I gave her a phone number to some faraway office or hotline. But I remember thinking later about De la Vega, about his dead and delirious companions, about all the questions I should have asked the woman. I arrived home that evening and threw my gun belt and uniform across the couch. Standing alone in my empty living room, I called my mother. I'm safe, I told her. I'm home. 3 decades after signing the Treaty La Masida, successive conventions of Mexican and United States diplomats convened in Washington, D.C. in 1882, 1884, and again in 1889 to discuss the state of the boundary between the two nations. In the years since the last boundary commission had concluded its work in 1856, settlers have been moving southwest in growing numbers to work on land holdings and newly discovered mines adjacent to the international border. In many places, the exact location of the boundary had become a matter of continuous debate, presenting great difficulty to government authorities on both sides of the line. In some cases, it was even charged that quarreling parties had destroyed or removed the boundary markers that had been erected at great cost to both countries into the previous decades. During the course of these binational meetings, the representatives of both countries agreed on the pressing need to determine the condition of the presenting boundaries moments. B. The number of destroyed or displaced monuments. C. The places settled or capable of eventual settlement, where it may be advised to set the monuments closer together along the line than at present. D. The character of the new monuments required, whether stone or iron, and their number, proximity in each case. The conventions thus called for establishment of a new International Boundary Commission, which was to possess the power and authority to reposition incorrectly placed or missing monuments, to erect new monuments on the site of former monuments where these shall have been destroyed, and to set new monuments at such points as may be necessary and be chosen by joint accord. In keeping with the trend towards consoling a well-demarcated and enforceable line, the convention agreement stipulated that the distance between the two consecutive monuments shall never exceed 8,000 meters, and that this limit may be reduced to those parts of the line which are inhabited or capable of habitation. In the course of ensuing their work, the commission found that most of the original markers were but rude piles of stone, while the intervals between them were found to be in some cases as great as 20 or 30 miles, and in one distance 101 miles. Some monuments had disappeared altogether, spirited away by wind or water, or swallowed by the landscape, as if they had never existed at all. The fulfillment of the Commission's duties ultimately led to repair and the replacement of 43 of the original boundary markers and the erection of 215 new iron monuments. The report filed by the Commission boasted that the 675-mile borderline that had ran from the Pacific coast to the Rio Grande were now better established and more clearly marked than ever before, with the average distance separating the monuments a mere 2.6 miles. It thus became likely, for the first time in history, that a person crossing north or south at any point along the line would see evidence of a boundary laid upon the earth, tiny obelisks reaching up towards the vast arc of the sky. Morales and I arrested 2 men walking aimlessly through the desert night, far from any known trail. The men did not run, but fell to their knees, their hands trembling above their heads in the pale glow of our flashlights. They followed our commands, nodding timidly. As we walked them, single file, to the patrol vehicle, I observed their gait heavy and shaped of purpose. Outside the processing center, Morales and I talked with the men while we searched their belongings. They were our age, mid-20s, and both hailed from the same mountain village in Oaxaca. One of them wore a baseball hat with the image of marijuana, with a marijuana leaf embroidered on the front. "You think it's cool to wear that hat with marijuana on it?" Morales asked him. The man seemed confused. "I didn't know it was a marijuana hat," he said. "It's the only kind they were selling." His companion, small and pot-bellied, listened, concerned. "Is that what marijuana looks like?" he asked. Morales and I rummaged through the men's backpacks, setting aside liquids, perishable foods, and anything that might be used as a weapon. In the bag that belonged to the man with the hat, Morales uncovered a pouch of thickly cut carne seca. The man smiled. I prepared it myself, he smiled. Standing a little straighter, Morales looked longingly at the jerky. Have some, the man offered. No se eca a beda. No thanks, Morales said. At the bottom of the pot-bellied man's backpack, I discovered a bag of grasshoppers and another filled with small dried fish. The man chuckled. I can't even pronounce that. He said, try the chupalines, he suggested, pointing to the grasshoppers. I shook some into my palm and glanced at Morales before tossing them in my mouth. The Oksana's left. Not bad, I said. Tasted like salt and lime. The men looked at me eagerly. See if you like jarlays, they said, gesturing towards the dried fish. I took one in my mouth, grimacing from the heavy salt. I dared Morales do the same. Fuck it, Morales said. I'm eating that jerky. For a short time we stood together with the men, laughing and eating, listening to their stories of home. As Morales prepared to escort them into the processing center, I gathered up the items to be discarded. I was about to toss a small water bottle when the pork-bellied man whispered that I shouldn't throw it away, that it held mezcal made from his family's ranch. His father harvested the maguey from the mountains around their village, he told me. It had been aging for 6 months. It's at its best right now, he said. Take it with you. Near the end of my shift, Mortensen called me into the processing room and asked me to translate for 2 girls who had just been brought in, 9 and 10-year-old sisters who were picked up with 2 women at a checkpoint. He told me to ask them basic questions. Where is your mother? In California. Who are the women that brought you here? Friends. Where are you from? Sinaloa. The girls peppered me with nervous questions in return. When could they go home? Where were the women who drove them? Could they call their mother? I tried to explain things to them, but they were too young, too bewildered, too distraught at being surrounded by men in uniform. One of the agents brought the girl a bag of Skittles, but even then they couldn't smile. They couldn't say thank you. They just stood there, looking at the candy with horror. Once the agents placed the girls in the holding cell, I told Mortensen I had to leave. My shift's over, I said. He told me that they needed to do an interview with the women who were picked up with the girls and asked me to stay and translate. I can't help anymore, I told him. I've got to go home. As I drove away from the station, I tried not to think of the girls, and my hand began to shake at the wheel. I wanted to call my mother, but it was too late. Several hours after sundown, Morales and I met at a remote trailhead to respond to a sensor hit. We hiked slowly by starlight across the stony foothills to the place where the small trail dropped down from the mountain pass. Morales took his flashlight and crouched to the ground with his hand over his face cap, shining a muted light over a small patch of dirt on the trail. The sign is days old, he whispered. He looked up to the black outline of the mountains. I bet whoever set that sensor off is still laid up at the top of the pass. We decided to wait for the group to come down the trail. We concealed ourselves behind a gnarly mesquite tree, Morales sitting cross-legged and me sprawled out on the desert floor, twisting my body until I found a patch of ground free from rocks. Morales smoothed a swath of earth with his hands and began to trace swirling lines as I gazed upward, fixed on the Milky Way trailing across the sky like a cloud of glimmering dust. For over an hour, the whirring of nearby crickets and soft pattering of kangaroo rats were the only sounds we heard. Periodically, I broke the silence to call attention to a shooting star, whispering to Morales if he had seen it. Si, vato, lo vi. After another hour of silence, I reached out to touch Morales' knee. "¿Qué?" he replied. "How much longer do we have to stay here?" I asked. "Shit," he said. "I don't know." We were silent again. I bet you there's scouts in these hills," I finally said. "They must have watched us hike in." Morales threw a stick at the patch of dirt in front of him. "Maybe the sensor hit was bad," he said. We could hike up the pass if they're still laid up there. If they're still laid up, we can bust the group, and if there's nobody there, we'll check the sensor for foot sign." I shook my head. If there are scouts, the group is long gone. If there's no scouts, the group is still up there. "They'll hear us coming before we get anywhere close. I've been up that trail with Mortensen," I told him. "The last quarter mile is steep as hell and covered with loose shale. If a sensor hit was bad in the first place," I said, "well, then it's even bigger waste of time." We walked back across the desert towards our vehicles. I paused and looked up once more at the moonless night sky, and Morales continued past me. After his footsteps had grown distant, I noted a tiny point of light drifting slowly across the black dome of the sky. Without moving my head, I called out to Morales. "Come back here," I shouted into the night. I could hear him grumbling as he made his way back to where I had stopped. "Que chingados quieres?" "Look," I said, pointing up to the sky. "I don't see anything," he complained. "It's a satellite," I said, "traveling away from the North Star." "Shit, Morales, I see it." Morales finally said, "I see it. Cabron, I've never seen one of those in my life." "Me neither," I said. We stood enveloped by the silence as we stared into the night sky, surrounded by figures hidden away in the hills and mountains, figures gazing up at the very same stars, toward barely discernible satellites barreling through the atmosphere, small bodies tenuously tethered to their orbits at the outermost limits of the earth.